Hi there, and welcome to another BigLipz podcast. My name is Sam Macaulay Blair, and as ever, I am joined by the wonderful Kathryn Maurice. The two of us are two independent filmmakers who have decided to start up our own podcast via our YouTube channel, BigLipz. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We have a first season where we discussed movies, and now we've moved on to the wonderful world of television. So this is our 14th episode. And we have basically every month we switch between doing content and concept episodes. Last time we did a concept episode, which was on pilots, and this week, which is in no way related, we're now doing a content episode where we are discussing the show Westworld. I was going to give it I was going to describe it in some way, but I was like, do you know what? I'll leave that for the meaty part of the podcast. So to get right into things,
fair.
Obviously we have mentioned this show a good few times before. So if you have watched a few of our episodes, then you probably do know roughly our opinions on the show. But we thought it would be good to actually dedicate a podcast. With the fourth season just coming to an end, we thought it'd be a good idea to dedicate a podcast specifically to the show, so we could actually just sit down and air out our thoughts. So Kathryn, when did you first hear about the show? How did you first get into it? What was your background with the show?
So basically, the reason I started watching the show was because my bestie started watching it. We lived together at the time. And I asked her before we started the podcast, I had asked her why she started watching it, and her reply was fear of AI taking over. So...
Does she just have like
her
ear to the ground on like
her life.
Any like anti or like potentially AI related shows? She's just like, I'm on that.
Yep, she's like, she's heard through the grapevine somewhere, and she's like, do you know what? I need to get in on that. I need to get all the research down. I need to know what's coming. So that's basically how she got into it, and she actually, and this is insane to me, who's a skinflint, but she actually bought the first 2 seasons of Westworld on Amazon Prime, which is commitment to the highest degree. So when I first started watching it, she had already seen the first 2 seasons, which were the only ones out at the time. So that must have been, 20...
18?
Sorry?
No, I was just curious.
2018, 2019, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I was just trying to get a timeline on when you actually first watched it.
Well, weirdly enough, I watched the first kind of season and a half with her, and then we sort of fell away from it. I can't remember why. I was desperately trying to think. I don't know whether it's we got different jobs or we just kind of fell away from it. The episodes are quite long.
AI seemed like less of a threat, so...
Yeah, exactly. She'd already seen it. She was comfortable with the narrative, so she's like, right, I've got it covered.
Fair.
But yeah, so I hadn't really heard of it. And I think I was kind of vaguely aware of it, like it being mentioned in passing, but I don't remember it. And still to this day, I don't feel like a huge amount of people, the people I know anyway, like have, I don't know anyone else except you that watches it, and my best pal. So there's that. I felt like if you talk to people about it, they haven't even really heard of it or anything like that. Which I thought was a bit odd, and then I had wondered if I would watch it had I not been, like, had Fiona not suggested to watch it.
Do you think
so
you would
have? I'd like to think so. I imagine it would have come up at some point. Obviously, when we started our course, we spoke about it, so I assume that someone on that course, had I not watched it, would have suggested it. It's like a film student's TV show. It was like made for film students.
Yeah,
in a way.
It very much is, isn't it?
So yeah, when obviously I said I watched a season and a half of it and then stopped. So when I watched it this time, I started again from the beginning. And I think that was definitely the way to go because it was so long ago that I watched the first kind of season and a half, and I also couldn't remember where I left off. So I feel like it was good to just start from the beginning and have. Fair. We had, like, as you know, we kind of binged it, so I had quite a short space of time in which to watch the whole thing, and I feel like it did and it didn't benefit from binging, but it was a pretty fun way to watch it.
Fair.
What about you? Did you start watching it independently, or?
So I can't remember exactly like how I first heard about it. I can't remember if it was like, again, just one of those like ear to the ground things where like I had an awareness of the show. I think I had like an awareness of the show existing in like some level, but I don't think I'd done like I think I was aware of it being made because I think it was around the same time that they were like, it just seemed to be like a trend for a while, like make movies into TV shows, like Fargo obviously being one. I know there's others that like just off the top of my head I can't like think of, just around the same time that I can't quite think of. But I know that it was like a bit of a thing for a while where like movies, you know, like older movies were just kind of being turned into TV shows, and I think there was a bit of like it was generally becoming like a well done thing. Like it wasn't like, okay, it's going to be perfect, but like there was, you know, a lot of shows were like, again, like Fargo being an example of something that like was doing it and doing it well. So I think I probably had like an awareness. I don't think I'd ever seen Westworld. I think I like maybe vaguely knew the premise of it. I feel like probably because of something like The Simpsons. I think The Simpsons do like a parody episodes of like the movie.
Oh, where they go to Itchy and Scratchy Land. That one.
Yeah, there must be. So I think I had like an awareness of what Westworld was. I think I had an awareness of like the show being made. And I remember, weirdly enough, I was living with a good friend of mine, and both of us met via like film school, and he had, I think he'd kind of talked about it a bit. He'd got me to start watching this show Humans, which was like done by Channel 4, and is also about like AI, and that grand like philosophical like question. It kind of like similar sort of themes, but like a very like condensed British version of it. And I remember the girl I was seeing at the time, she I think had watched Westworld, or was watching Westworld. I think it was like this first season was like airing, and I remember watching like Humans with her, and she was I think calling out the similarities, but I think she was a bit like, well, Humans is quite crap because it's just kind of like when you watch Westworld and then when you watch Humans, and like now thinking back, even though I've not seen that much of Humans, now thinking back, I can see what she means by like it is just like a much smaller scale, and it does kind of like take it does take away from Humans because you're like, well, I've seen this done on like a much more elaborate and it like arguably like much better done scale, and the two just don't really compare. Like it does feel like Westworld is very cinematic and Humans is kind of, it is in its own way, and it's like sort of British way, but not, it just doesn't really compare to like the vastness of Westworld. So I think that was kind of my awareness of it, was that it was like obviously very high production value, and I knew the sort of themes that it tackled, but I don't think I was hearing like buzz around it, like positive buzz, but I don't think it was like stratospheric. It wasn't like, you know, I don't think it was like on the same level as something like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad, where it was just like all you were ever hearing was how great the show was. I think it was a bit more muted, like you say. I think like I do know of people that watch it. It does definitely feel like something that like I feel like the show is in my mind, it's like a popular enough show, but I do agree with like what you say, that it's not a given that people watch it. Again, like Game of Thrones, and like kind of Breaking Bad, you know, they're shows where it's like more of a given that like people will have seen them. Whereas this one is a bit more like, well, have you seen Westworld? And sometimes people say yes, sometimes people say no. So, yeah, it's a very long-winded answer, but kind of similar. But I also did this weird thing, since you mentioned how you sort of started watching it. I also did this really weird thing where I'm pretty sure I watched the first episode when it was like the first season was airing, and I think I enjoyed it. I think I remember being like, that was really good, and then no idea why, I just did not watch anymore. Like I was just left, just like sat on it. Yeah, just totally slept on the show. To be fair, I think I ended up like moving to Canada for a month, and like I think my life kind of like took some mad somersaults. So I think it was just kind of like, it just kind of got lost. I think because there wasn't like an obvious place to watch it as well. It wasn't like, no, it's out now on like Now TV, but I don't think I had Now TV. I don't think Now TV existed then. So I don't think there was like an obvious place for me to like watch it, especially like moving internationally. It wasn't like it was on Netflix. So I think that was kind of why it was like a slight inconvenience to watch it, so it just kind of got left. And then it was, weirdly enough, just before I went to France, which was later on that same year. So it just seemed to be like a thing where I'd be like leaving the country, and I'd be like, yeah, Westworld, now's the time. But I did end
I
up
love it.
watching like all of the rest of season 1, which obviously at that point was all out, and kind of binging it, and I was like, blew my mind. I was like, wow, that was amazing. And then, funnily enough, my flatmate who I mentioned earlier, who had was aware of the show and had recommended Humans. I remember him specifically saying he wasn't going to watch Westworld for ages because they'd announced. I think they'd announced partway through season 1 that it was going to be like a long wait for season 2, like a good couple years. So I think he was like, he basically said he was like, I don't want to watch season 1, love the show, and then be like tortured by this long wait. He was like, I'm going to wait until like season 2's out or coming out, watch season 1 and then season 2. I actually don't think I've ever checked it up and seen I don't know if he's ever watched the show.
Do you know what? That's such a good point, actually, because now that you've said that, it's kind of sparked something. I think that could have been the reason we stopped watching season 2, is because we knew that season 3 was so far away, and it almost seemed... And I'm sure I looked it up. I'm sure they came out like within a year or 2 years of each other.
It's 2 years.
Like each season.
Yeah.
But that is a long time when you're really invested in a show.
Absolutely.
And I like to think that, like, out of spite, like myself and then your pal, obviously, I've been like, no, do you know what?
Yeah. If you want
I'm
us
not
to
gonna
wait,
watch that.
you want us to wait, we'll wait, but we're not watching these episodes either.
Exactly.
I love that. But yeah, no, so he I don't know if he's ever gone and watched it, but funnily enough, so I remember being really hyped for season 2 coming out because obviously I'd loved season 1. Watched the first episode of that. I think I rewatched season 1 with my like then girlfriend. Then we watched the first episode of season 2. I think we were on holiday, and then again, just did not watch. And I was like, that was really good. Did not watch any more of season 2. It was a really, really weird thing that it like happened twice, with like both seasons of the show. And then what wound up happening was I was then living in Manchester, and eventually it was like almost a year after it broadcast, season 2 came out on like DVD and Blu-ray, and I think I was just like, I'm just gonna buy the box set and I'm just gonna watch it, like, and I pretty much just like binged it again. And I was like, that was fantastic. And then finally, when season 3 came out, I remember having Now TV and being like, okay. And it was also the pandemic, so that was the first one where I actually watched it week to week and didn't binge it. And then season 4 again, like actually watched it like properly, legally, week to week. So yeah, no, that's a very, very, very long-winded answer to my background of like watching the show. So what were your expectations then? Just like off of what your best friend had said, like were they high? Were they sort of like tentative? Like what did you what sort of quality were you expecting, if any?
I feel like initially, like I still haven't seen the movie.
Same.
That it's based on. I feel like we're both. I looked at it. Came out in the 70s, so we're both far too young to have seen it. It's not really got like a kind of like cult status in the way that
I like you said that we're like too young to have seen it, as if like if it had come out in like 90s onwards we'd have had like an obligation to have seen it.
Yeah, exactly. Like 90s babies need to have seen this.
Only 90s kids will remember.
And exactly. I feel like this is, I don't know about you, but I feel like this is such a difficult show to describe to other people. Like I was saying, people, like I asked people, have you seen it? And they say, no, I haven't. What's that about? And I think the minute you say it's about a theme park full of robots that look like humans, people switch off because they think sci-fi.
Yeah.
And I've also got this weird thing where I think I hate sci-fi, but what I really hate is bad sci-fi.
Yeah.
I feel like when sci-fi is good, it's amazing.
Sorry.
I definitely... Oh, sorry. No, carry on.
I was just gonna jump on that that hating sci-fi line, because another girlfriend of mine, she used to say all the time that she hated sci-fi, but like a lot of her favorite films and shows were sci-fi, and like not even like slight sci-fi, like heavy sci-fi. And I used to just say to her, I was like, you genuinely don't hate sci-fi, like, because like a lot of your favorite things are sci-fi. And she just had like some, but she was, I mean, this was obviously like we were much younger, but I just remember she had some like really absurd reasons for like not liking sci-fi. Like I remember she used to be like, oh, I just hate like spaceships. Why are they always made of metal? And I'd like, what else would you make them out of?
What else would they be made of? Wood?
Yeah, no, like what of all the complaints Like, there are so many.
That's very, very specific.
Yeah, it's one that I've never heard anyone else say. But yeah, it just as you can tell, it's just stuck with me. But yeah, no, I think like
Very funny.
like you say, I guess yeah, like you say, I think it's not sci-fi. It's just bad sci-fi, and I think sometimes the two can be almost indistinguishable from a distance.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I feel like I was maybe not massively like buzzing for it, do you know what I mean? But at the same time, um I think it benefited from her having watched it on Amazon at the time, because that was when Amazon was bringing out really, really massive shows. Um, or and like the way that the shows that we watched at the time were tended to all be on Amazon for whatever reason, and they all had that kind of like large scale to them. So I think I did know kind of roughly what the scale would be. I knew some of the cast, so I was a little bit excited about that. And yeah, so basically, I knew that if she was recommending it to me, it would be good.
Okay, that's nice.
So yeah, that was pretty much. I feel like expectations on the show beginning, but like as it went on, I was a little bit nervous to watch seasons 3 and 4, because obviously this podcast is going to be packed full of spoilers. But so turn off now if you haven't seen it. But obviously, after season 2, they escape the park. So I was really nervous. Like that was the point where my expectations were like, I was super nervous about it to see what was going to happen, how it was going to go, how the show was going to change. So I feel like I had different expectations as the show went on as well, not just like, which was interesting, because sometimes when you're watching the show and if you just love it from the start, you're like, oh my god, you're just constantly buzzing. But so yeah, that was a little bit different, to be like excited for the show, but at the same time a little bit like, oh, apprehensive. Is what I would definitely say. What about you?
That's interesting. Yeah, again, I think like with what had kind of been said about high production values and everything, I think I definitely was like surprised by like just how good the first season was and how sort of clever it was. I don't know. I think because I'd heard good things, but again, not like, oh my god, mind blowing, amazing things. And I think because like I'd watched things like, I'd seen Game of Thrones. We talked about this sort of last time, where like, I ended up loving the first season of Game of Thrones, but not on the same level as everyone else seemed to. And it wasn't until maybe like a couple seasons into Game of Thrones that I was really like, okay, this is like absolutely, one of my favorite shows ever. Breaking Bad's another one where like I really enjoyed watching Breaking Bad, but at the time, and I feel like if I went back and watched it now, I'd have much more of an appreciation for it, to be fair. But I think at the time watching it, I was like, yeah, that was it was a really good show, but I wasn't quite on the same level of like adoration as everyone else. My brother's like a huge fan of Breaking Bad, and I was never like on the level of him. He's like rewatched the hell out of it and everything. And I've only ever seen it at one time, but its spin-off, to just go wildly off on a tangent here, Better Call Saul, which I had like zero expectations going in for, and I think that's a part of the reason why I've ended up liking that show so much. It might be like my favourite or second favourite show ever. Like I genuinely think Better Call Saul is like the pinnacle of TV, and it's obviously just wrapped up, and it pretty much was just like perfection. So yeah, so like that's the thing. Like I think with like Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad both being shows that I really like, but not being like this, not having that same like attachment and adoration as everyone else. I think like I kind of thought, okay, I'll like Westworld. Like I did think I was gonna like it, but I didn't think I was gonna like love it. And so season 1 did kind of like take me by surprise in that sense. I ended up like being much more fond of it than I sort of expected. So yeah, but I get what you mean about having different expectations for every season. I think I've gone in. I think I've probably gone in with high expectations every season since the first. But I think the thing that I find really interesting with the show, and we can probably will discuss this a little bit more in a bit, is that it kind of, I feel like it kind of in a way reinvents itself every season. Because the first season is so much like, okay, this is just like business as usual. This is the park, and it's very much just like it's everything going like array. I guess it's like throughout the course of the season, is everything actually like by the end of the season, it's like everything is now going wrong. You know, the park finally that's when like everything kind of flips on its head. So like season one does kind of like flip the, I guess like, flip the board for like season two. Season two is obviously like that kind of playing out, and is like basically just like the park falling apart and all the parks kind of like falling apart. Cause obviously you get introduced to other parks and everything, and then it's like them officially like sort of leaving the parks behind. And then season three is very much like the modern world, and like what, you know, life is like outside the park. And then obviously season four we have like a time jump again, and it's more about like, you know, sort of like apocalyptic. And yeah, it just, in season five, like where they seem to be taking that again seems to be something very different. So I find it very interesting because it does feel like every season they're like, okay, we're doing, you know, that's that contained chapter, and now we're doing like this contained chapter. So I feel like it's one of the interesting things about the show. So I get what you're saying about having like different expectations going into every season, because like it makes sense. It's not like, again, it's not like Game of Thrones, where as much as in my head I can like differentiate the seasons, it's still, you know, characters will stay in locations for multiple seasons, and, you know, even story arcs will like take place over multiple seasons. So it does feel a lot more like one like continuous thing. And even though Westworld is one continuous thing, it does feel like there's more distinctive like chapters. So obviously kind of mentioned this already, but how do you think Westworld compares to other shows? I think when there's our notes for this, I'd mentioned the fact that, you know, I guess in a sense it does feel like this show was sort of primed as a bit of a successor to Game of Thrones. You know, there was a lot of talk. Well, Game of Thrones was in its sort of peak about like, you know, what are HBO going to do once this show actually starts to wrap up. And I think Westworld kind of like went to production, and was the first season kind of came out well just as Game of Thrones was like overtaking the books. So that was kind of, I guess, it becoming, you know, people were aware, okay, there's not actually a lot of show. Yeah. Exactly. So there wasn't like tons of show left. So it very much was like, okay, well, what are HBO going to do to sustain like viewership? So yeah, I've stopped talking. I'll stop talking now because I've done enough of that.
Yeah, I think that was like a super interesting question, because I feel like it does have that like much bigger scale that we were talking about that kind of newer TV shows have. Where it felt, I had written in my notes that it kind of had this movie like film vibe, but at the same time it was you could tell it was very much a TV show. Like it just, I don't even know how you would describe it, but you know what I mean? Like it was, like you're saying, each season was like its own kind of contained thing, but it didn't feel like the way that movies would, where it was like a sequel. Do you know what I mean? Yep. It still felt like the one thing, even though they were so different. So I definitely had the kind of grandeur and scale in that of film, but I had such a TV like feel, and I feel like that is very kind of Game of Thrones. We've spoken about that before, obviously. That it kind of changed the game of TV shows, how we watch them, and how they're kind of presented and things like that. I think, obviously, Game of Thrones was good when it was good, but it's by no means my favourite show. And I feel like Westworld just does what Game of Thrones does, but does it better. Like, I feel like the writing is better. I have a huge problem with the acting in Game of Thrones, really? As you may have guessed, but that's not an issue in Westworld. And yeah, like, I feel like it's bizarre, like we were saying before, that it's not as popular as Game of Thrones. I don't know why that would be, like, whether it's maybe it's just like the case of Game of Thrones is a little bit like easier to watch. Do you know what I mean? Like Westworld it does hit you with these questions like these, and then you start to have an existential crisis halfway through watching it. Like it's maybe not the most relaxing show to watch.
True. And make sure you're like emotionally comfortable when you start watching it.
Yes, it makes sure you're mentally sound, like you're 100% grounded in your reality. Like, don't let there be any doubt if you start watching that show. I feel like, it's a weird one, because I can't think of a show now that maybe has the same, like a new show that's come out just now that has a similar type of scale. Even just in like not just like physically in scale, but like in narrative and plot as well. It's very like ambitious in what it's doing. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, those were my very rambling thoughts.
No, it's interesting.
What are your thoughts? Do you? Yeah.
It's interesting to you say that you think it's better than Game of Thrones, or you like it more than Game of Thrones. I get where you're. I totally get where you're coming from with it. I would say I probably prefer Game of Thrones, but
okay.
So, I think that's the thing. I think Westworld for me had the capacity to sort of exceed Game of Thrones in terms of like quality, and I think, and it's very. I've not really thought about it before. Like, why is one more popular than the other? And these things you can never actually like answer. There's not actually a way to know. Part of it is just like Game of Thrones came first, and was kind of like it kind of like redefined TV in its own way. And but I guess like one thing that Game of Thrones does really well is it really eases into the fantasy stuff. Like it really, it obviously has this like historical setting, and then really, really grounds like that in sort of modern day sensibilities and politics, and not necessarily modern day, but it is very like political. You don't really, you think of like a sort of fantastical medieval show. You don't really, until pre Game of Thrones, you didn't really think of like actual politics of like that. It's era appropriate. But, you had like political shows and stuff. You didn't really have like a medieval political show. And then obviously you have the fantasy stuff added in besides, but it does like trickle that stuff in. It's like hinted at very strongly, and then sort of like gradually starts like introducing it, and then obviously becomes very fantastical by the end. But it does very much like walk you there. Whereas like Westworld is obviously like very sci-fi right out the gate because it has to be. So I think that's probably part of it. I think as well, just like the whole nature of Game of Thrones as a show, and it being like political and very backstabby, is always gonna have like there's more sort of like water cooler moments, as it were, in Game of Thrones, where like you have like the Ned Stark thing, and then the Red Wedding, and you have all these like big seismic events that do obviously like just completely like obliterate people emotionally and like have like make big waves narratively. And I'm not saying when Westworld, again, as we just discussed, like it does kind of flip the board every season and stuff, but I think at the same time it doesn't quite have as many like aggressive twists and turns. I think it has like a more limited scope, and I think it just like, I guess like Game of Thrones is, I'm not saying Westworld isn't making statements, but Game of Thrones obviously makes statements about people and humanity, and kind of just says that people suck. Like really, really hammers that point home, and like in a really effective way for the most part. But whereas Westworld is more kind of like a question of like, well, where does humanity begin and end? Like what is human nature? What does it mean to have a soul, etc., etc. And I think because it's and that's a lot of the fun of the show, is making you think, but that's not as necessarily accessible and interesting, because again, I guess it's asking more of an audience. It's asking you to do a lot of like the work around the show, and it's interesting. I think questions are interesting, and it does make for interesting discussion, but it doesn't make for the same kind of like, you don't run into work the next day and go, oh, I have to ask my colleagues what they think makes a human being a human being.
Yeah, that's very true. Like I wouldn't go into work and be like, here's a theory, here's an example for you. If you think it's a robot, is it okay to kill it?
Yeah, thought experiment, guys.
Like that's not really like a conversation you can have between phone calls. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. One thing that I found interesting was to go back to like my experience of watching the show. So when I said I like binged season 2, funnily enough, that was around the same time as I was also playing through Red Dead Redemption 2, which if anyone of you or anyone doesn't know, is obviously like Rockstar, who make Grand Theft Auto. So they're like cowboy game. So it's like an open world Western game where you go around, and it's designed to be very realistic and obviously like sophisticated sort of AI programming. Like to the point where like you can catch criminals in that game, and like you get like a bounty on them. So like you take them to like the like the sheriff, and you get like paid out basically. But if you like return to that town like a few days later in like game time, the criminal that you caught will like be getting hung. So there's like it is actually like a very elaborately designed. Yeah, no, it's like very like elaborately designed in terms of like the way.
Is that the one where you also have to like make sure that you eat and wash or you'll stink, and you have to like kind of like
I don't.
tame the horse almost?
Yeah, I think yes and no. It's been years since I played it. I don't think it goes as far as like you have to eat or you will die, but I think it's things like you can.
Like The Sims.
Yeah, I think you do eat to like regain health, and I think there is a thing about like if you eat too much, your character actually does put on weight. There is like a muscle mass thing, so it does try to like. It tries to stay fun, basically. It doesn't try to actually
Yeah.
be like so intense that it becomes like a chore to just do anything in the world. It's very, very well balanced. Like, the game is incredible and has like a fantastic story. But it was just a bit odd playing like that and also watching Westworld, because I was like, there is an irony here to what I'm doing, and I feel like
Were you being controlled to play
Well,
the game by someone?
I feel like I definitely got like a lot nicer as I played the game, and I think that's like a, but I do feel like, did Westworld have an effect there? Was I becoming more and more conscious of like how I was treating these like pixels?
I love it.
So yeah, but yeah, as to round back to the point, yeah, I think Westworld doesn't quite get the love it deserves, and I think definitely like you actually say, I guess I'd not really thought about that as well. Is they're actually really, I can't actually think of another show that does have the same sort of like ambition and scale that it does. Like, you know, there are lots of big shows out there, but I can't think of anything that like so does such a good job of actually like making such grand statements, but doing it in such an eloquent way and taking like the risks it does narratively, and yeah, the obviously like the actual filming of it as well is immense.
I feel like it very much just does, like, it's very much got its story that it's going to tell, and it's just telling that story. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem like the kind of show that would be swayed in any way by like public outcry or people's. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels very much like here's the story that we want to tell. Here's how we're telling it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, it's got a trajectory in it. It's damn well sticking to it.
Exactly.
Again, we've kind of like touched on this a little bit, but what do you think are the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the show?
So the first strength I would argue for would be the writing of the show. And I find it very funny that it's based on a screenplay by Michael Crichton. I'm sure that's how you pronounce his name.
I think it is actually.
Yeah, who loves a good story about people in an unconventional theme park. And he does it very well, in fairness. Obviously, he also wrote the book for Jurassic Park.
It's such a weird niche, that, isn't it? But he has like nailed it.
He's cornered the market with that. Honestly, I can't think of another author that does it so well.
I feel like because he's done it so well, no one wants to go near it. Though we've already got the theme park going on, guy.
Exactly. But yeah, I feel like the writing overall is so strong. Like I was saying, it kind of knows where it's going. It knows what it's trying to say and what it's trying to get you to think about. I feel like it's very clever, but I was saying this to my fiance, like, it's at times very confusing, but it always lets you know what's happening.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like it's like you're being spoon-fed. Like, you're told what's happening, but you also kind of have to have been paying attention to figure out like or to like understand what's happening, which is nice. You're not hit over the head with clunky exposition like we were talking about last time. Never my fave. I also think it's quite good, and it could be because I kind of watched it in more of a binge, that it's actually full of plot twists, but in such a way that they're sparing enough that it doesn't feel like cliched or anything like that. Like, yeah, I feel like you don't quite see them coming, or if you see them coming, it's just before it's announced that you can figure it out. Like,
Yeah.
like one thing that I would think of is I can't remember what season it is, 3 I think, where you find out obviously that they've been taking data of all the guests that are in the park, and it was this, I think it's season 2 actually, in the split second before William said what it was, I was like, it's the hats. Like, and it's like almost fun and like interactive in that way. Do you know what I mean? It kind of gives you the tools to figure them out, and then confirms it so that you know whether you were right or not.
Did you guess the wee one that because they do that again? They pull that trick again in season 4, which really got me. Did you figure that one out?
Which one was that? Clearly not. I can't remember.
So in season 4, they're doing this. They tell you they're doing the same thing, but it's like updated. But they're using mirrors. And there's so many shots throughout like the season where like people are checking themselves out in the mirror, and I was like, that is so well done, because you
that
never.
That is very well
like,
done. I didn't get that one.
You just don't pick up on it at all, and that like I genuinely was just like, oh, fair play, Westworld.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of like really good moments like that, and they don't feel ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? Like it kind of like they take so much care in kind of like foreshadowing things, which again is credit to the writer. Another thing, and this seems like a very obvious point, but such a strength of the show is obviously the characters. And I feel like, considering that the most of the main characters are hosts, they have massive character development and character arcs and things like that. Obviously they've got much more of a scope to do that because they start as kind of two-dimensional robots, like the rancher's daughter kind of thing. But I feel like at the same time they also have pretty complex like human characters as well to kind of go against the hosts. Do you know what I mean? So it's not like all of the character driven things is from the hosts. It's the humans kind of match it as well, which is I found pretty interesting. Another thing we've spoken about obviously at length is the scale. I feel like especially in the first 2 seasons, the scale does a really good job of being like almost immersing you in the park, because it's kind of like that thing where you don't when you're in the park with the guests and the hosts, you can't see the boundaries in the way that the hosts can as well. So it does feel like they're in the Wild West kind of thing. I feel like that as well, that kind of I would argue that this point is maybe like scale and setting, because that kind of carries on in season 3 and 4 even when they're not in the park. Another one I really wanted to mention quickly was the music. I feel like it's such an interesting and noticeable thing in the show. It's very much like the music is there for a reason. Like it is also telling a story, as opposed to just other shows like I'm gonna slag it off again, but Grey's Anatomy. Very much they've heard like the beat, or my favorite thing that they do is they hear lyrics, like, and they take them very literally and just put them in the show, and it doesn't make sense. But Westworld, it feels like they really think about what they're doing with the music choices. And I read somewhere that was, I'm sure, like the contemporary music that the kind of like organ thing plays was all the choice of like Jonathan Nolan. Like he chose all of the different music and things, like, and he chose to have it contemporary songs in that kind of old timey setting. I liked as well what it does is it kind of does that. Again, this is maybe where the kind of movie vibe comes in, but like if you think of movies like Jaws or Star Wars, they have like specific themes for specific characters. And I feel like Westworld does that as well, but maybe not necessarily characters, but like there's music that represents Westworld and the Mariposa, and there's music that represents like the bad guys and William and things like that.
Yeah, well, I'd say there definitely are character themes, because I mean, I guess the obvious one is you mentioned William. Like he definitely has his own theme, which I think the sort of beauty of that like strand of music is, because I completely agree. I think like the soundtrack for the show is sublime, and I think like I think William's theme for me is like probably the most like notable example of that, where because obviously they have the whole like twist in season 1 with his character, and it's been a while since I've rewatched season 1, but I love the fact that just what they do with his theme being like so sinister when he's like Man in Black, but then there's obviously like the sort of tragic spin on it they put in it. They have like so many ways that they like sort of twist and turn his theme, to sort of suit his character and yeah, where his character is and how you should sort of be feeling about his character and what he's doing. And I just find that like fascinating. I think it's so clever, the fact that that they're able to take like what is quite like a simple, it seems like quite a simple piece of music and do so much with it, and evolve it in so many ways. And I think it is like perfectly sort of symbolic of the character, perfectly sort of tied to the character. And I think like the Dolores and stuff like that, and Maeve, and I think there are characters that do have their very like specific themes, and I think they are very sort of poetically woven together at points, and yeah, again developed in like a really really nice way. And I think it's the same composer that does Game of Thrones, so I think he's very good at, or did Game of Thrones, very very good at like being like, okay, we're gonna have very distinctive themes for these different characters, and even I think the instruments and stuff used to play characters' themes at like different points, and I think even that is like quite emblematic of like, well, you know, what is this character supposed to be? How are they presented? You know, or do they just seem like, does it just seem like this is like a farm girl? Are you aware that, okay, that, you know, maybe this character is a bit more cyber, like, again, I guess you have like Dolores, who starts off as sort of like the innocent like farm girl and obviously has like a huge arc, but then you have like Maeve, and her character is more about the fact that she is like a sentient piece of tech, because she's kind of like, in the first season she's kind of like hacking herself, and kind of like actually it's more mechanical with her, and I think her theme is more kind of like mechanical as a result, and just like things like that I think is just really really clever, because it's all these ways of like connecting like things that you understand about music subconsciously, connecting it to the character, so you can like, even without knowing what like the character's themes are, you could probably figure out who the themes are tied to and when in their story they're sort of tied to, and like you said, the whole like anachronistic, having like modern songs played, and like, and they do it culturally as well with like season 2, because obviously they have like it's not called Eastworld, I think Shogun World it's called. Why do they not call it Eastworld? You have Westworld, you have Eastworld.
I know.
Right there.
Don't.
It's just,
it was right there. I'm like, why didn't you see that? You've written everything else so perfectly.
Exactly. I know. That's his weakness. No Eastworld. But yeah, they obviously have like, because they do the paint it black scene. The scene, it's like a heist scene, and they have like paint it black playing and like old timey piano music, in season 1, and then they do it again with like the sort of feudal Japan sort of strings and woodwork, and they even have like I think they have like Seven Nation Army, but like the Indian version, which is just like, again, like a really cool touch, and I think in season 4 they have, what is it, Bad Guy by Billie Eilish, but like 1920s like sort of Chicago style.
Yes, like roaring 20s kind of. Yeah,
exactly, and it becomes. And I think season 3 has, I can't remember what the song is, but they have like a sort of modern, or futuristic, I think, version of it. So they actually flip it in that one, where it's like, okay, because it's like the present day for that world, but obviously like our future, they then do the same with the music, where it's like still contemporary songs, but now recontextualizing to the future. So again,
they also had sorry, the one that's just sprung into mind is Lana Del Rey. They had video games playing at one point.
Yes, they did. Yeah, again, like you say, it's just they're so on point with like their music choices, and it's just like such an interesting thing to like, to recontextualize music in that way, and just that fusion of like, again, I feel like it so perfectly like sums up the experience of like what Westworld is, because it's like, it is this immersive, you are in the past, but it is also futuristic, and so there is something a bit off about it, and that whole like, you're hearing like what you at first sort of like you just naturally kind of take in as like old timey music, because they do have like their own like originally composed like Westworld-y like originally like, again, like sort of piano music, and then when you start hearing like, it takes you, I feel like the first time you're watching it takes you a minute to be like, I recognise that.
Yep. Again, there was a few times where we were watching it where you were like, what is that song? And then it would just click. So yeah, I feel like music is obviously a big one. In terms of weaknesses, one of them for me was at times pacing.
Okay.
And I would argue that because obviously the I feel there's obviously like a few very distinct storylines. There's Dolores and what she's doing, and then Maeve and what she's doing. Obviously these kind of intertwine and things like that, but some of the time there's very much like this is an episode about Dolores,
Yeah.
to the point where you don't see Maeve or Hector or any others at all. To the point where I feel like if I was watching it week to week, it would be annoying in that way where you're like, because do you know that way sometimes you'd be watching it and you'd be like, where's Maeve? What's Maeve up to? Or what is Dolores doing? Yeah, I feel like, but at the same time, I don't know if it would be any better if they were like always joined. You know what I mean? If it was always switching between the storylines, that kind of maybe goes back to your thing where you were talking about how they're just very distinct seasons. It's almost like they're quite distinct episodes within those seasons as well.
Yeah, I would say as someone who's just like obviously watched season 3 and 4 week to week and having like binge season 1 and 2, I would actually say, thinking about it, that I maybe weirdly enough, I think the way that like having, like you say, almost like individual episodes focus on like individual characters actually works better week to week than it does during a binge. And I haven't really thought about it until now, but it's a weird thing, and I don't even know if I can fully explain why. I think it might be because like trying to compare it to Game of Thrones, which obviously does juggle all these narratives and very much does advance like pretty much like every episode. You know, like maybe you have the odd episode that doesn't touch on with like a key character, but generally it will advance like these, like you get like one scene for like one character in an episode, and it moves them on. And I actually think like that can kind of be more frustrating because it just feels like, you know, you just get like teased with a little bit and you're kind of just like, okay, great, now to wait to the next episode to see like whatever's going to come next. Whereas it's almost fair. Like a bit more comfortable when you're watching like each episode and you're like, okay, you're getting like Maeve scenes, but you're getting like actual development on that story, so you can kind of like sit down and get invested in it while you're just watching that one episode, and it's more like satisfying because you have like a sort of more contained like story happening rather than just like a scene. Whereas like I think when you're binging it, it does maybe feel weirder to be like, oh, we've not checked in on that character for a while. Like it probably does hurt the pacing on the binge because like it does feel like you're taking these like long detours. So
I feel like
that's.
No, sorry, I was going to say that's a good point as well, because I feel like we were talking about, I feel like the story that it's trying to tell is maybe more complex, so it needs that amount of time. But like you're saying, it could just be because the way that we watched, the way that I watched it, which was a binge, and especially if you've got like your favourite characters or that, you want to see what they're doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was one of mine. Another one, and this is just a little niggle, and this is again a bit of a bizarre choice, but the constant like kind of this idea of like immortality with the hosts, and I feel like again it could be because it's because of the way that I watched it, because it was binged, but there's a lot of, it seems like the main hosts are dying, but you know that they're gonna come back. It very much, like we've spoken about it before with different shows, where it kind of takes away the urgency of it, and then it's cleverly done, but they die, especially Dolores and Maeve, they die constantly, and every time they die it seems to be that's the last time, that's it, and then something comes up and they're just back to normal after an episode or two. And I think it definitely doesn't help that I binge watched it, but that it definitely takes something away from it a little bit, because you think you weren't even shocked when they died anymore, because you were like, well, something's going to happen to bring them back. Even when they weren't in the park and they weren't getting fixed and sent back up, think like how many times did Maeve die and then suddenly she was reanimated? Do you know what I mean? Even when they were outside the park, they didn't have any of the printers to print them. Somehow they thought of a way, and it didn't feel like, you know how when you're watching like a bad movie or something, or a bad TV show and the main character just can't die, like a horror movie, and you know that person's not going to die. It didn't feel like that. It didn't feel cheap or anything like that, but it was like on reflection a little bit, took away from it a little bit, where you were watching it and it appeared that Dolores was dead once and for all. And in my head, I was like, but she's probably not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so that basically again like aligns with something I've said. So I kind of like I guess phrased / explained it in different ways, slightly different ways, in my notes. But I feel like you mentioned the character's been really good, and I agree. But I think, and I think this is a sort of problem from like season 1 onwards, or after season 1 really, is I think it's kind of like too anchored to its successes. I feel like the show is kind of, because it does such a good job in the first season of like introducing all this like this whole world, and you know all these characters, and like they all fit together so in like such an interesting way, and season 2 very much like sticks to the same characters, but also does do some like does flesh out some like smaller characters in a really really like compelling way, I thought, and actually kind of like makes you re-examine them, and I thought that was like brilliant, and it kind of shows like their capacity to sort of expand the cast. And I feel like as it kind of goes on, I feel like we're still generally watching like the same core cast of characters that we were watching in season 1. You know, there's maybe like 1 or 2 characters in there that are new, and it does just kind of feel a bit like, because obviously they have killed off a couple characters permanently, but yeah, like you say, it kind of feels like they've written themselves into a slight corner because they want to be really dramatic and have high stakes, so they don't want, you know, everyone to get away every time and win every time. But at the same time, like you say, they'll kill characters off, and then they will like find a bit of a contrived way of bringing them back. And it does just feel like, you know, it felt like in season 3, I did feel like the stakes were a bit higher because they're like you say, they're like, we're not in the park anymore, so it's not as simple as like we can't just bring everyone back. But season 4 in particular, and I think at the end of season 3, obviously they have the whole thing with like Dolores, and it kind of seems like she's done. But then again, season 4, it's like she's back, and then on top of that, Teddy's back, and again, it does just feel like in season 4 when characters are getting killed off, like, you know, I think like Maeve gets killed off like early in the season, and as it was happening, I was like, she's absolutely gonna be fine. Like I don't believe,
100%.
Don't believe for a second she's gone, and like. Aaron Paul's character Caleb, he gets killed off, and arguably he is killed off, like he's then brought back as a host, so it's like, okay, he does die there, but even then it does just feel a bit like, okay, but I'm not really gonna mourn him, because like, you know, I don't think that's the end of his character. Like his character will still live on, and I think you say it's the same with like William and Bernard and all of them, like even within, I think it's like the cliffhanger of the second last episode into the last episode, where Tessa Thompson's version of what was her name again? Her version of Charlotte. That's it, Charlotte Hale. Yeah, she gets killed off, and then like immediately the next episode she's like in a new body, and it's like, of course.
Yeah, like she was being scooped out of that water, and I was like, yep.
Exactly, and it just. Like you say, it just gets to the point now where like, even watching it week to week, I'm just like, come on, like I know that you aren't actually, you don't. It's part of it is just like, you don't have enough characters to just kill them off. So I feel like the show has really hurt itself in that way. I feel like it needed to be a bit braver and expanded its characters more, and I think it missed a trick by and I understand why they did this. But I think like looking at the full run of the show, they missed a trick by not. So obviously when they introduced not Eastworld, Shogun World, and like the other parks and stuff, by having them, you know, basically saying, oh, these are actually just like Westworld, and they've just redressed them, like they've just reskinned them, they're being lazy. Which again, they're making a statement by doing that. Like it makes sense with like the overall sort of theme and messaging and everything, and like what they're saying about human nature and stuff like that. But it just, part of it is just a bit like disappointing, because like there's such an opportunity there for like season 1 obviously builds like such an interesting world, and it would have just been really cool to see them like try and do something similar to sort of like continue to flesh out, and to be, you know, to have season 2 where it's like, okay, we're still going to develop the season 1 characters in the season 1 world, but we're also now going to introduce some new characters from like this other park, and like, you know, people who are maybe like dealing with that, and you know, it feels like there was a lot of scope where they could have, like, you know, looking back now, because you know we're going into hopefully going into the final season. I say hopefully as in like hopefully it happens, not like I know that we said season 5. So in season 5, well, just because obviously the whole HBO Max and Warner thing where like everything's just getting culled, so like nothing is safe right now. So Westworld is now a question of like maybe it will finish, maybe it won't. But anyway, yeah, I just feel like looking back at like the show, like, you know, it's too late now for you'd be annoyed almost if they were like season 5 and everyone there's all these new characters.
Yeah.
It's just like a bit like you had the chance to do that, but you kind of didn't. And I feel like it kind of needed to do that. It kind of needed to like be bringing more characters in so that it then could kill off. You know, then you could have had Dolores die at the end of season 3 and have that be her meaningful exit. So yeah, I just that's again very very, and the Man in Black, like he dies every season. Like
He was getting very like, do you know, it was getting very much to the point where I was like, come on. Do you know what I mean?
I think
Like
yeah,
he was a human as well. Like how many times do you need to be shot and stabbed? Do you know what I mean? Until you die.
I know. It just and I felt like season 2 they kind of like rounded off his character perfectly. And then when he was in season 3, I was a bit like, okay. And then it felt like in season 3, they wrote out his character like every episode or every second episode where they were like, this is the last we'll see of him, and it's like a tragic end. And then it's like an episode or 2 later, he's back, and you're like, come on!
Yeah. Apparently, I read somewhere that the actor, Ed Harris, is that his name? He really was like very outspoken about who he didn't like his what he had to work with on season 3.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And yet they brought him back for season 4.
They were like, well, you didn't like that? Well, now you're hooked up to a machine.
Exactly.
And the only person you get to talk to is yourself.
Maybe that was his punishment.
Yeah, don't toy with his head.
Yeah, like they just left him there, like between takes and stuff, just hooked up to that thing.
Yeah, they only used 1% of the footage they shot.
Yeah.
The scripts he got were very different to everyone else's. Season 4 in his eyes was a chamber piece, quite literally. Yeah, so sorry again to just like hijack what you were saying, but I do think that like I do very much agree. It does. The more they do it, the more it does feel cheap.
Yeah. 100%.
Anything else that hasn't been mentioned?
I've mentioned kind of briefly before them escaping the park felt, especially in season 3, like a very like it felt like such a drastic shift. And I feel like it definitely wasn't at its strongest when it wasn't in the park, I would argue. But
I would agree.
We'll discuss that later.
Yeah. That's very true. Actually, that's very true. I guess like, you know, you've pretty much like touched on all my major points. Like I guess one thing you haven't necessarily said is that I think the cinematography is obviously like outstanding. I think like it's shot incredibly well. Obviously, I think like you kind of mentioned obviously like, talking about the production values and stuff, but I guess like it's easy to kind of forget like just how good a job the show does with its world, and like having it, all aspects of it be convincing. Like it doesn't ever actually feel like, oh, this is just a TV. You know, when you look at like all the sci-fi shows out there, and you can look at like a screenshot of them, and it just kind of feels like people walking about like CGI cities or green screens. But it does always feel like, I think they probably do a really good job of sets and practicals, and I think really sort of like minimalistic, like simplistic like design. I think I actually weirdly remember noticing like the lampposts that they had like designed for like season 4, just again.
Matched the shape of the tower as well.
Yeah, exactly. Which is again just like a nice wee like sort of foreshadowing detail and Easter egg type thing, but also it's just a really cool piece of like set design, and does make it feel like a real environment that these people are walking about in. I think it does a really good job of like, it always feels like it should. It always feels believable, and obviously part of that is the writing, because the writing is obviously really really strong. And I think once again we mentioned this a lot, but like it's such a philosophical show, but does it in such an accessible and interesting way. It does leave you with questions, but doesn't ever feel like it's, I guess, like sort of holier than thou, and it feels like it's sort of using it to connect with its audience, rather than being like preachy, or you know, being really obtuse and really sort of like indecipherable. Like you say, it's really good in knowing where its audience is. For the most part, I think it does kind of lose that a little bit with like later seasons, but again, we'll get into that in a minute. And I think obviously acting is like phenomenal.
Yeah.
Because again, you're having like just like the layers that like the actors have to bring in terms of like playing robots, playing people, and then different versions of people, and sometimes in like scenes they're like changing the way they act, and yeah, it's so immaculately done, and like there's so many subtleties and things like that. And again, I think again like season 3, one thing it does really well is like the whole, which I thought was a fantastic twist with like Dolores. Dolores, just like they have this whole thing of like, oh, she's saved all these like hosts, you know, these very specific.
That was
hosts.
amazing. That was like
And-
peak Dolores.
Yeah, the twist is that nope, she's just saved several of herself, and that to me was like one of the cleverest things the show's done, because I was like you say, it's such a good twist for it's like, of course that's what the character did, but it's also something that only that show could do, because it's not a twist that could really exist in like any other context as well. But it then means that you have characters, and that then you then realize you're like, okay, these are characters that are playing different versions of the same. These actors playing different versions of the same character, but also still kind of like then playing like other personas. And it does that. It's hard to just kind of get your head around that idea. And the show does pull it off, like I think pretty much flawlessly. So yeah, I would say one weakness with its like character writing as well is the fact that while the characters are really well, they develop really well, and you know they do take them really interesting places. I do think sometimes, and I think this is like one of the problems with it now having gone on for as long as it has, you know, being the end of season 4. I think, and again, it's the nature of like the story they're telling, but I do feel like it feels like the characters could be, I guess there could be a little bit more to them, not in terms of like, you know, they are well rounded and you know you know a lot about them, but a lot of the time it does just kind of feel like the characters are acting kind of the same. You know, they're always kind of like running away from something or running towards something or kind of dealing with something or figuring something out or like losing something. You don't really get a lot of time for the characters to be characters. There's not many like pauses for breath where, you know, you actually get like a sort of deeper insight into the things that they like care about and beyond like each other, if that makes sense. You know, you don't really. I think you maybe had that slightly earlier on, maybe with like Dolores and things like that, but I don't think you actually get like, you know, Aaron Paul's character Caleb, outside of his kid, what is he like? What's, you know,
outside of his beloved Frankie.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
I'm like, Caleb, give it a rest.
And I love Aaron Paul, but like his character is just really like, he just loses things a lot, doesn't he? Like he's just kind of like endlessly distressed, and it's just like, it would just be nice to have like some moments in there where you have like, I don't know, you know, to compare it to a video game again, I guess you have The Last of Us, which is this like brutal apocalyptic story, but it does such a good job of like, there's just these moments where the characters like will find something of like the old world, and one of the characters like has a history in that world, the other one never born in that world. So you just have these like interesting moments where they'll maybe like talk about or discuss or briefly discuss or just reflect on something that like one character has a different understanding of than the other one. Like it means something to one character, doesn't mean anything to the other, but they're curious about it. And it's just such a nice way of like humanizing these characters. And again, it's just these like really small moments of beauty and amongst this really like bleak story. And I feel like Westworld could have done with things like that, where again, especially now where it's moved its story, you could have these moments of like characters understanding versus not understanding things, especially with like the synthetic human thing. And I just feel like it would have done a lot more. I think it would make the show, I guess it would have like helped it emotionally connect with its audience and probably help it like expand its audience. So yeah. Anyway, rambled enough about that. What is your favourite series of the show, out of curiosity?
So this one I would have to go with season 1, if I'm honest. But it was a tough race between season 1 and 2. But
nice.
The reason I went with season 1 is just, I feel like it just like beautifully sets up this entire world. The characters, you know, kind of like we were saying, you kind of can feel where it's going. It's also, I feel like, super interesting to watch, especially like Maeve when she kind of comes into herself and she's like you were saying, like hacking herself and making herself more intelligent and things like that. And then to see the kind of struggle with Dolores for her to be like, when she starts to question things, when she starts to kind of develop a consciousness and things like that. um I feel like that's super interesting, and it definitely, like, without spoon feeding you or force feeding you, it kind of like makes you start to question things like, is that okay? Like, she is still a robot, but
Yeah.
is she still a robot if she's starting to have independent thoughts? Like, I feel like it's just, I would choose season one because it's obviously the first time we see that, the first time we experience it. I feel like it's done so well. um I also think that it's got great twists in season one. The twist that William is the Man in Black was very good, very fun to watch. Also, I think it's season one where you discover that Bernard is a host. I
Yeah.
remember that moment was amazing. That was the moment where he was like, "What door?" Oh my god, that was like
Yeah.
peak season one. It was so good. Um, and obviously, like, it's always going to be better first time around, maybe, where you see all these things for the first time.
Yeah.
And I feel like it very much sets up the second season, and it sets up this kind. I feel like it sets up these rules, um, for the show to follow, and then it can kind of bend the rules if and when it chooses. Um, so yeah, I would say seasons one and two are definitely the strongest, but if pushed, I would go for season one. What would you go for?
Fair. I think I would say season two personally.
Fair.
Just because, and I feel like if I rewatched the show, I might think differently. Like rewatched it all. 'Cause season one's the only one that I've seen twice, and I did watch it again. Like I mentioned, sort of in quite close proximity to having first seen it. So that always kind of hurts something. I feel like because you just remember a bit too
Yeah.
much of it to really like you don't get the same hit the second time anyway. But you definitely don't get the same hit when it's like quite close together. I think season two did really blow me away, and I felt like it had some incredible moments, and I think
Mm-hmm.
even though I went in with high expectations, I think it still really surprised me. I think it did a really good job. I think I sort of mentioned fleshing out some of the side characters in like really surprising ways,
Mm-hmm.
where just like almost out of nowhere, where I suddenly was like, that was actually, I didn't expect it to do that. Didn't feel like it needed to do that, but I now have like so much more on. Yeah, it did a lot for me. Again, I like what they did with like William, the Man in Black character, and it did feel like it kind of like ended that quite nicely. Guess not. And
Mm-hmm.
I liked as well the sort of like framing device of like there sort of being the stuff going on in the sort of present-ish, and then like it also giving you like the context, the sort of like lead into it. I thought that was like quite well done, where you didn't really
Mm-hmm.
know what was happening when, and kind of playing a bit with that. I thought like the way it sort of, again, I thought they did some really cool things to sort of expand the lore, and I like the explanation behind like what the park actually is, what it's for. Because again, it wasn't something I'd really thought about, but I like the
Mm-hmm.
fact that I hadn't, and I like the answer. It makes perfect sense with like the world they've built and everything. Um, I think season one, again, like you say, there's just some phenomenal moments, and like just that experience of watching it for the first time was like unlike anything else. So definitely, like season one is like basically neck and neck with it. I think the thing
Yeah.
that hurts season one for me, and I only really like got gripey about this on the rewatch, was I think like there's just some stuff. I think the Maeve stuff in particular, as much as I love what they do with that character and the way that they take it, it does feel a bit contrived. Like it does just feel a bit like the show's kind of a bit like, I don't think too much about like how no one else is picking up on what's going on there.
Yeah.
And I think when you rewatch it, like again, like quite close proximity, there is just like when you're actively looking for it, I think it's you do kind of think a bit like, well, how is no one else noticing? Considering how heavily monitored everything is, how's no one else noticing that they're just like having these chats and she's doing all these things? Like it just felt a bit. It just felt like they could have maybe like worked that out a little bit clearer and made that a bit like more believable. It
Mm-hmm.
feels like it does take some leaps in that one. So for me, that's kind of like where it was hurt the most. And Yeah, I think that probably is like the most like damaging part of season one for me. I think whereas like season two, again, if I rewatched it, I'd maybe like see more like notice more of its flaws. But having only just watched them both, like having only just watched that one the once, I just remember being blown away and just being like, okay, like that was pretty damn perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, very fair.
So obviously just discussed our favourite season. Now for the less positive side, also known as the negative side. What is your least favourite season of the show?
So my least favourite season was season 3. I feel like the kind of tonal and maybe like aesthetic shift was so drastic and so jarring from season 2 to season 3. And I feel like it lost a little bit of its kind of Westworld feel, if you know what I mean. And
It's
I feel
just
like it
world
did.
now.
It's just world, exactly. I feel like it did get that back in season 4. I don't know whether it was just the kind of cinematography. But yeah, season 3 just was not great for me. I feel like this constant barrage of like this new cool technology and things, stuff like that, for me was pretty boring. Like stuff like that is I just don't find it particularly interesting. Like I didn't think it was particularly cool. Like I mean it was cool, but I just don't care. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, if
No,
you don't
sorry.
mind me interjecting, I'm not, I guess, like agreeing really, because season 3 was also my least favourite.
Shocker.
Take that, Westworld. Yeah, I don't even think it's because I was looking for, like, that's the thing. Like for me, it felt like season 3 should have been okay. So this is now where the show begins. Like now, it
Yeah.
feels like that should have been like now that you're leaving the park. Like you just expanded the world. Like the scope is suddenly the potential scope is now so much bigger, and like the park I think itself is so interesting, and obviously a big part of that is obviously, as we mentioned, the sort of philosophies behind it and the philosophies that are tied to it. So you're always going to have it be interesting in that way, but it did feel like the world that they were sort of building around it and the glimpses that you were getting were so interesting that I don't know, it felt like there should have been a bit more to the world. It feels like the world itself around it feels quite thin. It kind of just feels like all the all the sort of scenes that you see, all the kind of like people in boardrooms and staring at computer screens and projections, which is what you kind of get in like season 1 and 2. It kind of just feels like the world in season 3 is just like that. Like that's all it really is. There's not really any like. It doesn't feel like there's much depth to it.
Yeah.
Like, and I know they kind of tried to even like the introduction of like Adam Paul's character Caleb. Again, having like you're having someone who's like you would never get in the park. Someone who's like working class and had a bit of a sort of like rough life. Yeah, it just didn't. It felt like that he should have been a lot more interesting than he was.
Yeah.
And the cop out answer is like, oh, they're doing like a Blade Runner thing where the robots are more interesting and more human than the humans. But like that's been done in Blade Runner, and at that point in like where the show is and the statements it was making, it didn't feel like it needed that. Like
that's a
it
good
felt-
point as well, because sorry,
No,
I think we've had a discussion about this before. I haven't seen Blade Runner all the way through because I was not massively keen on it. Are you keen on the first one?
No.
No, I didn't think so. That's interesting.
I
They were like, let's go for Blade Runner, and we're like, don't like Blade Runner.
Yeah, I really dig the second one. I really dig 2049. I think 2049 is the one to watch. I think it like for me it kind of just nails a lot of what the first one tries to do. I think the first one is very much, I appreciate it for what it did, and obviously there's so much that's like drawn from it. And I feel like that if I'd watched it at the time, I feel like I probably would have like a much higher opinion of it because it broke a lot of ground and all these things. But yeah, it's flawed, and without derailing again this too much and turning it into, although it is quite an appropriate like discussion, Blade Runner. It's actually impressive we made it this far and only now we're talking about Blade Runner.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think Blade Runner doesn't work as well as it should for me. And yeah, I think season 3, like you say, you get all this like sort of sci-fi tech and stuff, but it does kind of just feel like the sci-fi tech that you get in like other things. It doesn't feel doesn't feel like particular to Westworld and like its own interesting. I
Yeah.
think there's maybe like hints and flavors of it, but it just feels like they could have done a bit more with it again. It could have gone a bit further and it could have been a bit more Westworldy. Like again, it feels like there's a lot of scope there for them to introduce all these new like technologies that people kind of live by and this whole world that like and maybe like works in a completely different way. And again, I know that the more you do that, the more you kind of take away from the commentary it's making on our world. But it does feel like it just feels like it should be more interesting than it is, and maybe better thought out. And I guess that's the advantage something like Game of Thrones has over Westworld is that it has such a dense world, and the more it the more it shows you of that world, the more you see. But obviously, that is written by like a very George R. R. Martin obviously spent years writing those books, and they've got more and more elaborate because he's like fleshed out the world so much. So that's Westworld obviously is as much as like it takes longer than most shows. It doesn't have the same like world building behind the scenes as like Game of Thrones, so it's kind of like an unfair comparison. Anything more you wanted to say on season 3?
I feel like the more I thought about it, the more it felt very much like season 3 was slightly needless. Like there was a lot of characters that were introduced and then actually killed off in season 3 that I didn't even spare a thought for in season 4. Do you know what I mean? Like the Sorok character or I can't even remember his name. I think his name is Liam something. The one that kind of Dolores.
I'm not gonna lie. Like, I've watched season 3 since it came out, and I'd forgotten about both of those characters.
Yeah, exactly, and they're big parts of the season, and I feel like it just feels in my eyes pointless the entire season. Like yes, we needed to see the transition from them leaving the park to the point where it's like 23 years later in season 4, but it just, or 7 years later, I can't remember, there's some time shift, but I think
it's 7 then 23, isn't it? So it's a nice round 30 altogether.
Fair, but I feel like it was completely. There was nice moments like we were talking about where it turns out that all of the hosts that Dolores brought out were Dolores, and watching especially like Tessa Thompson acting as kind of like Dolores as Charlotte and kind of struggling with that was definitely one of the highs. But all in all, I feel like it was, you could, if you jumped mistakenly somehow from season 2 to season 4, you would probably be alright.
Yeah. I know, I think the writers even said actually after, I think I remember reading after season 3 was finished, that they were like, okay, like season 4 is kind of where we wanted to go with it. We kind of made season 3 to set up season 4. And I think that's, because obviously season 1 and 2 I think are 10 episodes and season 3 and 4 are 8. And I remember thinking when season 3 finished, I was like, it's weird because they had less episodes and it felt like, but it also felt like the story was so much thinner. Like you would think it would be like
that's such a good point, because the story and like you were saying, the world just feels very, very like thin and flat. Like there wasn't much depth or substance to season 3, I would argue.
Yeah, no, it definitely felt like a lot shallower. It kind of felt a bit as well at points where like I think season 3 and I think season 4 is a little bit guilty of this as well. Maybe more in the beginning than like towards the end, but it did also feel a bit like the show thought it was being as clever as it was in its earlier days, but it wasn't really. Like it kind of felt like the audience was a lot more, and part of that is like you kind of learn with the show. Once you kind of understand the writing and the way it kind of works and how the tricks they sort of pull, it is kind of harder for the show to then like deceive you and have these twists and turns, because you kind of know you get like a feel for like when they're setting something up.
Yeah.
So it did feel a little bit like the show thought it was being very clever, and it was just a bit like, you're not being as clever as you think you are. They were so great again.
Yeah.
The Dolores thing was really well done and stuff. There was stuff in there that was brilliant, but it did also feel like that was the first time where I was like, there was like reveals that kind of like fell a bit flat and didn't really land the way that the show thought they were landing. It didn't feel like it worked as well. As like you say, it probably would have been more interesting to go from season 3 to season 4. And then, because then I feel like if you condense the 2 seasons, you then would have had a much more interesting like singular season. You could have like one 10 episode season that would have been much stronger than like having season 3 and season 4. So I guess we're going to touch on this a bit already, but character wise, any notable characters, any ones that you would like to discuss?
So I'll start with the best, of course, Maeve. She is 100% my favourite, has been since season 1. I feel like she's so funny, like she's quick-witted, she's clever. I really like, as I said before, I really liked season 1 watching her go through this kind of awakening. And there was that great moment where she sees like the people that work for the park basically, and she draws a picture of them, and then she goes to her floorboards and there's like multiple pictures of them. That was such a good bit. And yeah, so her kind of change from like the madam, like this sassy madam, to like because she still retains some of that, which I think is really funny. Because I don't know what, like, is that a choice? Did she choose to remain that kind of like sassy kind of character? Yeah, and then there's a interesting moment where Anthony Hopkins' character, whose name I've completely forgotten,
like the car.
Ford. Yeah, it's kind of revealed that he's put it in her code for her to escape, but then at the very last second she decides no, she's not going to, she's going to go back and get her daughter. So that was like a nice moment where she was actually finally like free. Yeah, and I feel like she's... One of my issues with season 3 and 4 is that they became very, like, all of the women became very... And this is a weird thing to have an issue with, but became very, like, badass kung fu fighters, and it felt very contrived. Like, did you know how to do that in the park, or have you learned that since? Like, it was a bit weird for me, but I do like Maeve. She always feels like a badass. Like, she is a little bit cliched, and she's very much like a character, but she's very fun to watch at the same time.
I just while you're talking about Maeve, because I absolutely love Maeve as well. I think with like the later seasons, I think like, because I'd love her character all the way through it, but I think the issue, thinking about it, with like sort of where her character is in seasons 3 and 4, is I almost feel like they don't do her justice by establishing threat around her, if that makes sense. Like, I guess season 1, you know, she's like such a small part of like the park, and she manages to like kind of go up against this like giant, as it were, and break free against like all sort of odds, and that's like so interesting. And again, as I mentioned before, like contrived in the way that it's kind of done, but it's such an interesting like arc, and like, you know, a situation for the character to be in, and like obstacle for her to overcome. And I feel like almost like the obstacle, like the obstacle that she faces, she because she just gets better and more powerful and stronger, and there's never anything, you know, it's kind of unrealistic at this point for them to just like invent. They kind of just have to like be like, oh yeah, this is like a really big dangerous thing that you're now facing, kind of come from nowhere. Whereas I think that's kind of like that's what kind of doesn't do the character justice, is it feels like the character at points is kind of like, she just kind of feels a bit like led by the writing in a sense. Like if Maeve's in danger, it feels like because the writers have decided Maeve's in danger, rather than like actually feeling like she's come up against like a competent threat. And again, I think that's part of like the fact that the show doesn't have enough characters. You know, there's not enough going on that you can realistically have her against like these like strong opponents that she has to like outwit or outsmart or outfight. So it does kind of feel like, again, it starts to feel a little bit repetitive rather than interesting. And one thing that like I love the character, but one thing that like I've like long since stopped caring about, and even the show stopped caring about, is obviously her whole like her daughter thing.
Her daughter. She's up there with Caleb with the daughter thing.
And I think it's just one of those things where like you kind of become, I feel like you become very quickly aware. I feel like after season 1 or like in season 1, you become very aware. You're like, okay, realistic. Like Maeve's never getting to her daughter. She like, you know, that's the end of the character.
I'm like, her daughter's already moved on. Do you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
Like, mum, she's fine.
Exactly. Like that is the end of the character. So it is just a bit like, you know that it's never going to happen. So every time it's like, oh, I need to get back to my daughter, you're just like, like, come on.
Yeah, because there's that like kind of sad bit where she does reunite with her daughter, and then her daughter's like, "New mum," and like, that woman's also done nothing wrong. Do you know what I mean? And you're gonna come and snatch her daughter away? Like she thinks that that's her daughter the same way you do. So.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and that's a really interesting like philosophical question, and I think as well. And they do touch on it, but I feel like I still kind of feel like there's maybe a bit more there in the sense of the idea of like her whole attachment to her kid is like manufactured. You know, that is like a part of her programming, and it's interesting that is like the one prevalent binding thing like that. It like overrides everything else. It's an interesting quirk that like she's the character.
It's not like she sticks to her code that she's a madam of a brothel. Do you know what I mean? Like that would be very entertaining to watch.
I know. Yeah, that would be like I'd be always say the character. I feel like that probably would have been a more interesting arc. Actually, would have been like throughout maybe the later seasons. Would have been if they'd done that. If they'd had her realize that she was defaulting to these like behaviors and like wants and needs that were very much like part of her programming, and she had to like kind of like bit by bit like erode them from herself. I feel like that would have been like a more interesting obstacle for her, because then it becomes like a philosophical thing, doesn't it? Of like how much can she sand away before she stops being herself, rather than it just being like, well, what's Maeve going to use her kung fu and like matrix powers on this season?
Exactly. It became very much like that, and then the whole of season 3, she decided she was like a samurai, so she was carrying around her samurai sword the entire time, which she ditched for season 4. Like
samurai days are behind her now.
Amazing.
Just it's not a phase, Mom.
Exactly. Another one, of course, we couldn't talk about Westworld without talking about is Dolores. I feel like very much Dolores like is Westworld.
Yeah. I think season 4 cemented that, didn't it?
Yeah, because I remember there being like watching the end of season 3 when it appears that Dolores is gone. I was like, how are they gonna have season 4 without her? Yeah. Like I could feel that they could have it without Maeve or without Charlotte or without the Man in Black, but they couldn't, I feel, have it without Dolores. Which is funny because having said that, she's by no means my favourite character. She's just, I feel like her kind of growth in self-awareness in the park, obviously because when she has this like growth, she becomes a different character, also manufactured by the people in the park, so it doesn't feel, because it's not the same way that Maeve kind of develops, and it feels like it. I think the juxtaposition between the two is really good, because it Dolores as Wyatt kind of like just annoys me, because I'm like, you think that you're self-aware but you're not. Yeah. Like that is what's, but at the same time she's having these thoughts, and she's just, I feel like my issue with her in season 2 is that she's not as clever as Maeve, but she certainly thinks that she is.
See, I think that was what I liked about season 2, was that you had these two characters that like all through season 1 you kind of think they're on the same side, they're on the same side, and then I like the fact that in season 2, I think it's like early on they meet and it's like they're actually not on the same side at all, and I thought that was like a really interesting way to play it, was to actually go, okay. And they then carry that forward. Again.
Because it's kind of like an ongoing thing from season 2 onwards, that it's kind of like Dolores versus Maeve.
Yeah. But I feel like it was more interesting in like the earlier day, back in the old days. Just because at that time it was like such an interesting idea that it hadn't occurred to me that they wouldn't. Maybe it's the racist in me, but I was like, well, they're both robots, so obviously they're gonna get along. But I like the fact that like, you know, it's like, no, actually they kind of really want different things, and they are different things, like you say. Like Dolores is almost like these different personalities programmed into like the same body, and there's reasons for that and stuff that again are very well done. But yeah, it felt like the potential of that was more interesting than like the actual execution. Because like you say, like there's the fact that Dolores does see herself, and the show kind of makes her like the kind of like the main protagonist / antagonist, whereas Maeve is like arguably more of like a side / minor character. But like you say, Maeve has actually accomplished a lot more with a lot less.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, another one. Sticking with my theme of strong female characters, of course, is Charlotte Hale. I feel like obviously she was introduced kind of like season. I think was it late season one, season two, kind of where she showed up. And I remember halfway through season two, I was getting so fed up where I was like, someone needs to put a bullet in her. She was so like, she kind of actually, speaking of Game of Thrones, she reminded me of Cersei Lannister, but like
Yeah.
as a much more clever Cersei Lannister, because Cersei's issue is that she thought she was so clever, but she was
Mm.
just like stupid and evil. Whereas Charlotte somehow was worse because like she knew exactly what she was doing. She was happy to sacrifice all these people if the company could get their data or whatever it is. And I am kind of glad it feeds into that thing that you were talking about that you didn't necessarily like, where they just keep kind of bringing back the same characters. But I did like her character in season 4, where it was kind of Dolores, but kind of Charlotte, but kind of coming into their own
Yeah.
person, basically. So yeah, I felt like she was like a really interesting character. She also had some crazy kung fu moves, that I don't know where she got them from, but yeah, I feel like her part of season 4 was definitely probably arguably the most interesting part.
Yeah, yeah, the whole. See, it's a funny one because like I feel like the character on paper, like worked better than it did in execution.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something a little bit shallow about. I really like season 4, but I did think there was something a little bit shallow about it. And again, it felt a little bit limited, even though its scope was really big and it did some really interesting things. And I think again, it's like she's a really interesting character, but for a lot of her scenes are kind of just the same because it's her just kind of walking about doing the same thing, where she's just like, kind of trying to just
Pouting
like she's in
endlessly.
control.
Tessa Thompson is endlessly pouting.
Yeah, and I guess this as well because like Tessa Thompson is like a really charismatic, energetic actor, and you've seen her in like some incredible roles, and it almost feels a bit like I don't know if it's just like it's almost a shame to just see her be like very sort of stoic, and
Yeah.
not actually do that much. I mean, obviously, again, there's like a lot of subtlety to like the performance, but a lot of it, and I guess it's just like less interesting as well when she is just like the one in control.
Mm-hmm.
And it does kind of feel like a bit like she does things that kind of sets up her own, I guess, destruction or demise. Like obviously, like just kind of giving William, like making another William and just kind of giving him like free reign on himself. And Caleb, like just making like infinite Calebs. Just felt like why not? Why not have infinite Calebs? And it's like you're building these people, like they're robots. Like I know the whole thing, but yeah, they're actually like they're human, they're beings and stuff. But at the same time, like they are. You must acknowledge in some level that they're robots because like you keep killing the Calebs. So
Yeah.
like, there's
Like you incinerate them. That's not very
yeah,
humane.
exactly. So like on some level, you don't see them as the same as you. So like yeah, if you're gonna do that, then like program them a little bit.
Yeah.
Put some fail safes in there.
A
I-
100%. Like they did it in the park with that little joint in their neck that made them explode. Like you could have taken some ideas for the park.
exactly. Like yeah, again, it kind of feels like contrived and like yeah, almost like a reverse Maeve thing where like it's like contrived and it feels like that she's doing that because the show wants to keep Caleb about, rather than she's doing that because she would ever do that. So I think
Yeah.
like those are my issues with. Again, it kind of comes down to like the writing around her rather than like her as a character because I do like her as a character. But I just feel like again, I guess with Maeve as well, it's almost like they just don't do her justice. With like the dilemma
I
they put
wonder
her
if
in.
that's like because almost like the actors are like out acting the character. Do you know what I mean? Because they're both phenomenal. Um, like I'm like, do you think they were just like, God, these girls are amazing.
It's a
Like
good
they've
point,
gone above
actually.
and beyond.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. Like, yeah, the cast for the show are too good. I
Exactly.
I buy
There
into
are
it.
worse.
And
There are worse problems to have.
before we move on to the last point, any other characters that you want to mention? Any others that stand out?
I think another one who's he's just a weird, complicated character, obviously through design, and that's Bernard. Again, not my favorite character. I feel like one point in season 2 that's maybe not as strong is Bernard's points, and it's interesting, but I feel like it's very convoluted. Like I said, that the show wasn't the show is complicated, but it kind of, you're fed the answers at the same time. Where I feel like Bernard's, where he's jumping all over through time and he doesn't know where he is or when he is, that got pretty old pretty quickly for me. And I don't know whether that's like Bernard as a character or maybe the performance, but yeah, Bernard's just not my favourite. But I feel like he's one of the showrunners' favourites. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it very much feels like, oh, let's put Bernard in this scene. Like he's a good character. I'm like, yes, he is a very good character and he's interesting. And the fact that when it's revealed that he's a host, that was amazing. But at the same time, he just doesn't, like, when Bernard's on the screen, I'm not like, oh yeah, it's Bernard. Do you know what I mean? Like he verges on being boring somehow.
I think that's you hit the nail on the end of that one a little bit. I think for me, I think season 1 and season 4, so I'm like more inclined to be a bit more biased towards him now. But I think season 1 and season 4 are like the most interesting Bernard's been. I really like the whole thing they did in season 4 with him, like his like sort of precog ability, just because like do you know what, it just made him a little bit cheeky. And I think Bernard needed that.
He was a little bit sassy in season 4.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of gave him something. I think it took the boring out of him a little bit. Whereas, I do very much agree that before that, he's just, again, he's another one who's just a bit very like serious and kind of like, he's just a bit unfortunate. You know, like good things don't really happen to Bernard, do they? I mean, good things don't really happen to anyone, but like Bernard kind of just like internalizes it a bit. So, It's just I think he does just get, and I would actually struggle looking back to tell you what his storyline was. And I know that obviously season 2 they have like the narrative jumping about, but I honestly would really struggle to tell you what happens with Bernard in season 2. In season 3, I know that he ends up in that like chair in the Sublime. Honest to God, I couldn't tell you. I think it starts off where he's like on a farm.
He's like a farmer, and then because he's got his little thing to control himself. Even like that would be interesting in another host hands. But somehow, I think it's that thing where Bernard is so like, kind of like moral in a way that's very boring in TV shows. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm not here, like much like the guests. I'm here for the drama and the murder and the fighting. Do you know what I mean? I'm not here for Bernard over here having an existential crisis.
But yeah, Bernard's not going to break bad, is he? He's just going to kind of like freak out a bit and get sad. So
yeah, I love that all the other characters, like you're saying, bad things happen to them and they go and get revenge. Bad things happen to Bernard and he's like, oh, that's a shame.
He just kind of pouts at it, doesn't he? And
what about you? Did you have any others you wanted to mention?
You kind of mentioned the main ones. I think Ford is really interesting in season 1. Just he's a really good like presence. It's Anthony Hopkins does a lot, doesn't he? And again, as like the kind of like orchestrator of the whole thing, he just has a really interesting like standpoint, and he has his own philosophies and everything that I think just brought a lot to the show. And again, that's what I mean. I feel like they could have done that because it's very much like Westworld is his thing. And like, well, Shogun World? Who's the Ford of Shogun World? Like, is it Ford? Was it some? And again, these are like questions that I feel like could have been interesting to answer, and I feel like the answer probably is, well, it's just an extension of Ford because they just copy all the writing and stuff. But he was so like anal as well and sort of meticulous, like the writers and things like that, and that was like really interesting as well. But like he was like, you know, he really pushed like it had to be believable, but he also had his own thing that he was doing. So yeah, I feel like Ford was cool. And
one thing, sorry, but just very quickly, one thing I really liked about Ford, and it was so subtle, was that he was like so comfortable around the hosts. Like there was never a moment where he felt in any danger or anything like that, and it was very subtly done, but it was so nice to like when you noticed it. Like other people were slightly maybe apprehensive, or they'd be less likely to turn their back on the hosts, but Ford was just in there chilling.
It's a really good point. Actually, I never really thought about it, but now that you say it, like immediately it comes to mind the fact that like his the way his like demeanor around the hosts was very different to everyone else. You very much
Yeah.
got the impression that this is the man that created them. Um, like you could just kind of tell that. I feel like you could watch any scene from like season one, and you would be like, yeah, that guy made them. If you
Yeah.
kind of knew a bit about like the background. One character I want to mention quickly, just not in such a positive light, but obviously we have talked about him, Caleb. Um,
Okay.
Like again, we have kind of talked about it already, but I just feel like they could have done so much more with that character.
Yeah.
And again, Adam Paul, phenomenal. I think the most interesting thing they've done with him is that episode where he's like escaping, and it's just like he's just like passing loads of dead Calebs.
Yes, that was such a good episode, and the one where he's in the vent and then there's two of them on the ground.
And he uses himself to break his own fall, and
amazing.
That felt very Westworldy, and that it's like this is the sort of like nightmare type scenario that could only exist within the world of this show, and it feels like that's sort of stretching and using its premise in an original way. That was cool, but yeah, his whole again, I feel like part of the mistake of his character is having him. I just feel like him being like a marine, just automatically sort of writes out boring character. You know, you just kind of have like slightly macho and PTSD, and it's a character we've seen a billion times. It just kind of feels a bit thin. Doesn't feel like there's not much to the character. So yeah, just before the podcast was done, I kind of wanted to get a little extra like hits in on Caleb. So just to kind of finally round up, what are your sort of thoughts on the future and conclusion? Because again, did mention it before, like it's not guaranteed at this point. I don't think that we're going to get a season 5, and I think they have said they plan for season 5 to be the end. Do you think that's right? Like, do you want there to be a season 5? Do you think season 5 should be the end? Yeah.
I feel like if there wasn't a season 5, it maybe wouldn't be the end of the world, because I feel like it's obviously like a nice bookend, because she goes back to what appears to be Westworld. So in that sense, it's a nice little bookend. It starts with the train, it ends with the train. But I feel like while we were we've obviously spoken, it feels like they've got their own trajectory, so I feel like it would be really interesting to see what they do with it. And in terms of like AI and stuff like that, surely part of the point is that they're constantly evolving. So in theory, the hosts should be the ones who win, because they're like progressing and kind of innovating at a faster rate than we can.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's that part of me that would kind of like that kind of Orwellian 1984 where it's futile for them to fight. I do think that would also be interesting to see, that there's no way that they're going to win, because the humans are the masters. They're the ones that created the AI, so they're the ones that in the end have the control. So I don't know. I feel like it could go a lot of different ways, but I think it would be beneficial if the 5th season came out, just because it seems that they know so well where they're going to go with it. So it would be really interesting to see how they choose to finish it.
I'd not actually thought about like season 4 working as an ending, just because I think I knew going into season 4 that it wasn't going to be like the very last. I think I read prior to season 4, during season 4, that they want season 5 to be the end. So I think I hadn't actually thought about how season 4 might work as an end, but I think you're right. Like it does kind of work in its own sort of way, which is quite nice. But yeah, I very much would like to see what like their long-term goal has been with this. And interestingly, I think I read like a quick snippet where they mentioned the fact that, like, as you say, like they kind of view it almost as like a cautionary tale, but it's like, especially with the way things are going, not to get like political or philosophical like out with the podcast, but where the human race is, we're not guaranteed survival, we're not guaranteed like a happy ever after. And part of me, I feel like that makes it interesting going into season 5, because that is the one where again we've talked about we've talked about obviously like it kind of like fubbing death and cheating itself a little bit, and it'd be interesting to go in where like, okay, this time the stakes are kind of real because there isn't going to be another season, so this is the one where if they're going to kill off characters permanently, they're going to do it in this one.
They can't bring them back.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd be very disappointed if it didn't get a season 5. I feel like the show overall would be hurt by not having a definitive conclusion.
Yeah.
You know, and I want to see where they land on it, and I would be really interesting, like you say, if they actually do go all in on the, do you know what, like we don't deserve to win, and we kind of can't. We have like bested ourselves almost with like designing this technology, and they've kind of gone that way a little bit already. But it would be nice to see them go all the way with it, and yeah, it just would be nice to, as a viewer, to go in and see and to actually believe the stakes this time, and see where they take it. So yeah, I would like an end to the story.
Yeah.
So I'm very much with you there. And on that note, finally wrap this podcast up. Thank you so much for your time, Kathryn. And obviously,
No worries, thank
those who
you.
watched.
Super interesting, as always.
I know. Next week and obviously next month, it's back to you. Ball's in your court. So you'll be back to hosting and choosing our topics, and I'm very much excited for it. Thank you so much once again, and until then,
No worries, thank you.
farewell.
See you later.